In this video, I will try to make an ordered and systematic comment of the preface to the first edition of The Science of Logic by Hegel from officially 1812, and I will take the German version, which is this one, Die Wissenschaft der Logik, but I also have with me The Science of Logic in English and La Science de la Logique, livre premier, lettres, in French. And I don't know who you are yet as a viewer, but if you are interested in my channel, not if you do not just randomly stumble upon my channel, or if you watch some of my videos here and there, but if you really believe that I have something interesting to say, then my piece of advice would be that you should buy the English edition of The Science of Logic, or whatever your natural language is, if it exists in your country. I don't know what your nationality is. I guess that most of my viewers are English or English-speaking people, or Americans, I guess. But if you are from, I don't know, from Asia, and if you speak English, and if you stumble upon this channel, or if you feel interested in what I have to say, I advise you to buy The Science of Logic of Hegel in the language that you understand the most, while knowing, to be honest, that I believe that it has to be read in German to be properly understood. So I myself, I try to read The Science of Logic in German, and I translate with my own limited knowledge of English into English. But yeah. So I will comment just the preface, the Vorrede, of the first edition in the German version. There are 4.5 pages, and I will make a systematic comment. But before I begin, I would like to say that I have a great deal of admiration for Nietzsche. I have not read a lot about Nietzsche, but I think I have read enough to understand the spirit of Nietzsche, one could say. And Nietzsche has helped me through pretty dark times, and he has been a great source of inspiration, and he has caused some of my greatest pains, I would say, but also my greatest laughters. So I owe a lot to Nietzsche. And if I tried to be Nietzschean, maybe this task is too difficult for me, I don't know, but if I wanted to be faithful to be faithful to Nietzsche, who is the murderer of God, is kind of ironic, but if Nietzsche was with us, he would laugh, because he would say, I was a great comedian. If I wanted to be faithful to Nietzsche, which in my best moment I try, I would want, if that's possible, to make the study of logic a joyful science. So if I could make a comment, I would say Die Wissenschaft der Logik should be die fröhliche Wissenschaft der Logik, the gay science, the joyful science of logic. I don't know if it's possible, but if I have to be honest with God, and I know that God is this infinite, all-knowing intelligence living, as of now, God knows where, but I know that God expects me to try to be honest, but he knows that it's difficult to be completely honest, but maybe he knows that I am doing my best, and my relationship to God, the idea that I have of God, is that I should praise God as long as I can, because when I'm in a position that I cannot no longer praise God, I will be in a difficult position. So I will try to praise God as long as I can, and if I had to say something positive about God, I would say that The Science of Logic by Hegel is one of the most spiritual books ever written, and also one of the most comical. When one understands the speculative depth of logic, this is the most comical, most brilliant idea ever, maybe. And yeah. So, let us be more serious now. I have one question to which I have no answer, but it is inspired by Slavoj Zizek. He talks about the structure of toilets in France, Germany, and England. That's a very famous recurring joke in Zizek. And he wonders if there is a a reason for that. I don't know. But if I had to be honest, England, France, and Germany, historically, in the modern era, let us say for the past 500 years, maybe more, but let us just say the past 500 years, have been the most influential nations on earth. One could say, to simplify, that in antiquity, there were the Egyptians, of course, but mostly the Greeks and the Romans. Of course, there were the Persians, and there were the Indians and the Chinese, and so on and so forth. But in Western culture, antiquity means mostly the Greeks and the Romans. Then there was the Middle Ages and a rebirth in the Renaissance in predominantly northern Italy. So Italy played a very important role in the Renaissance, and this is one of the few countries which played a very important historical role more than once, because the Romans were Italians in a way, and in the Renaissance, Italy gave birth and gave rise to the modern development of capitalism partly, but art, creativity, knowledge, a return to a pagan philosophy, a revival of the knowledge of antiquity. So, and then in the 20th century, Italy invented fascism, which inspired German National Socialism. So Italy has played a very important and very significant role at least 2 times and maybe 3 times in the history of human spirit. So it should be noted. But if we leave aside Italy, the modern world, beginning in the 16th century and influenced by the Renaissance and the ideas coming forth and bursting forth and coming from Italy, the modern world was shaped by a relationship between Germany, France, and England, and it includes the Netherlands and Belgium, which are kind of in the middle, and Switzerland also, and Scotland, which is partly England. I know that it may upset I'm sorry. It may upset some Englishmen or some Scots if I say that England and Scotland are kind of the same, because I'm sorry. I think I will try to become serious again. For a non-English or non-Scottish person who is not familiar with the story of these 2 countries, the English and the Scots are kind of the same, to simplify. So, yeah. So what I wanted to say is that the relationship between England, France, and Germany, which includes Switzerland, Scotland, Ireland, even Wales, but mostly Scotland, the Netherlands and Belgium, this is the core which has shaped modernity. Most of the ideas which have shaped the modern world, not only in Europe, but in the entire world, have sprung forth, or have come from this core and the interaction between these three poles, one could say these three countries. And the Battle of Waterloo, led by Napoleon, was thought in the core of the triangle. It was in Belgium, I guess. It was in the middle of the three centers of intellectual influence. And it was a major event in world history. Yeah. And when I say England, I mean the consequences of the development of England. It means the United States, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. So when I say England, I mean the United States of America also, which is an offshoot of England mostly, and also of Germany and Nordic and Northern Europe and Northwestern Europe. I simplify, but the idea is that the modern world has been greatly influenced by these three nations. And yeah, that's just a thought. So, I will begin the systematic comment. I made a video a couple of days ago about the spiritual history of Europe. And I am starting to understand that the recurring features which pervade the history of the intellectual and spiritual development of Europe for at least the past 500 years are still present in the modern world, in our day and age, in the development of the European mind and the European spirit. So what I think I have understood it is that it is possible, and it may be even necessary, to have a backward, retrospective consideration of the development of European history, which has shaped world history, and to at the same time have an interpretation and a consideration of the present age. And the development of ideas which occurred at the turning point of the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in Germany has been one of the most influential, if not the most influential era in the whole of mankind, because the moment that begins symbolically with Die Kritik der reinen Vernunft by Kant, and which ends symbolically with the death of Hegel, or the Encyclopedia in 1817, I don't know, but this period of broadly 30 years, to simplify, has seen a concentration of spiritual ideas in all fields of life: philosophical, political, aesthetic, religious, economic. I'm talking about the Germanic core, but it happened at the same time in Germany, in France with the French Revolution, in England with the Industrial Revolution. So the period which goes from the second half of the 18th century to the first half of the 19th century, I take a really broad, really vast era, has seen a tremendous change which has influenced and impacted the whole world for the past 200 years in a dramatic fashion. And Hegel begins his preface die Vorrede zur ersten Ausgabe, the preface to the first edition, by talking that the complete change which the philosophical way of thinking has seen over the past 25 years, so it means since the second edition of Kant's Kritik der reinen Vernunft, hasn't had any influence upon the state, the structure of logic. So in order to understand what Hegel means, one has to understand broadly what happened in this period of time. Kant wanted to save metaphysics, which is the conceptual knowledge of non-physical entities like God, the soul, the world in its totality, and the thing, the object of ontology. So metaphysics had undergone a process of criticism from the Anglo-Saxon and the French mind, beginning with it began with Francis Bacon officially, but it became more and more developed with the rise of Newtonian science, which was by celebrating the power of science as we understand it, the ability that science had to explain the world in rational terms. Newton dealt a deadly blow, one could say, to God and to metaphysics, although he himself was a believer and a deep Christian, as far as I know. But the ability to explain the phenomena, the celestial phenomena and the earthly phenomena, as expounded by Newton, was so powerful that it kind of ridiculed the armchair thinking of the speculative metaphysicians who tried to deduce the existence of the world from the knowledge of God by wandering in the spheres of pure reason. Someone like Leibniz. And the French, and also the English, but I am more familiar with French history. The French, through a person like Voltaire. Voltaire was not really a great philosopher, but he was mostly inspired by the English. He wrote English philosophical letters, I guess. He had a trip to England where he studied English thought, and he was deeply influenced by Locke, who was an empiricist, namely the idea that one has to gather the data about the world and the truth about the world by experimenting, by making experiences, and by one can only validate what is true by experiencing directly. And one should not speculate about what things are, but one should experience and test and validate through a direct, immediate relationship with the object. I simplify to the utmost. And Voltaire was deeply influenced by Locke, by Newtonian science. He helped spread the idea of Newton in France. He was deeply influenced by the English political system, which allowed a greater liberty than what was in France. He was deeply impressed by the religious tolerance of the English, which allowed the various sects to flower. And he says, in England, we can do business with the Jews, with the Muslims, with the various sects of Protestants, because people do not care about religion. They only care about being paid and having their money. I simplify, but that's kind of the mercantile, business-minded vision of Voltaire. But Voltaire helped, through his lyrical genius, spread the ideas of the English in France, which was then the most populated and probably one of the most powerful countries in Europe and therefore in the world. And the French attacked metaphysics and the metaphysicians, and back then the keepers of the metaphysical knowledge were mostly religious men. Not only there had been non-religious philosophers like Spinoza, non-religious in the sense that he did not belong to the church, but the great metaphysicians had always been officially religious, namely Christian, or members of the church directly, priests, or I don't know. I don't have the vocabulary in English to say that those who are in high ranks of the church. So yeah, so the French mostly used the powerful explanatory possibility offered by Newtonian science to ridicule and to discredit and discard the supposed the fake knowledge, in their view, the fake knowledge of the religious men and the metaphysicians. And this created materialism, atheism, deism, theism, the idea that God is just the entity responsible for creating Newton's laws, but that he doesn't care about the world, he's not involved in the world, he's just a mathematician who structures the clock working aspect of the universe. So it's almost as if there was no God in this view. So the success of Newtonian science sparked the Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, and it gave the impulse to mostly the French, but also the English and the Scottish, and partly in Italy and Germany, the will to question everything and to question the authority and the power that comes with it of those who were the embodiment of divine knowledge on earth, namely the priests, and with them the kings and the aristocrats. And there were questions in the realm of metaphysics, science, religion, and it, because everything is interconnected, that's a very Hegelian idea, it brought forth the questioning of the political legitimacy or lack thereof of those in power. And it is the French, because they are kind of excessive sometimes, who questioned politically in the most radical fashion the legitimacy of the current state of being in the political realm. This brought forth the French Revolution with the will to eradicate Christianity. Not all of them, but there were revolutionaries who wanted to eliminate, physically to eliminate the church members, but also ideologically to eliminate God, or to celebrate what Robespierre called the supreme being, which was a complete an idea complete devoid of any determination. So an empty God. The supreme being, as Hegel would say, is like the supreme nothing. So, because in pure being there is nothing. So if one wanted to make a Hegelian joke, one could say that Robespierre was a Buddhist, because the Buddhists celebrate the void, the emptiness, the nothing, and since pure nothing is pure being, by celebrating the supreme being, Robespierre introduced Buddhism in the heart of Europe at the end of the 18th century. That's a speculative, spiritual consideration of French history. So yeah, and maybe someday the Buddhists will understand this joke and they will laugh, and I don't know. Yeah. So Hegel says that, yeah, and now I will talk about this. So I simplify. This is the historical, political, epistemological, philosophical story of mid-17th, 17th and 18th century in 24 minutes. If you want more details, more explanations, you can buy books, you can study scholars. I try to simplify to the utmost, to set the broad picture. And in this context of the Age of Enlightenment, which was mostly a French, English, Scottish phenomenon, and partly German also, a man like Kant was a thinker of the Enlightenment. So Kant, who was a deeply religious man, he was also very intelligent, and he saw and understood that metaphysics, which is the conceptual knowledge of God, basically, was being threatened, and that God was being questioned, and that God was some sort of in danger of being left aside or forgotten, maybe. And Kant, who was deeply religious, he cared about God. So he tried to save metaphysics by taking into account all the negative criticism brought forth by the anti-metaphysicians against metaphysics for the past 150 years, but mostly in his own century, in the 18th century. So this was already a Hegelian process, because Kant was already the negation of the negative. So yeah, and the fundamental idea of Kant was that before trying to know what the object is, be it God, the world, the soul, one should investigate the subject which wants to know. And the question of Kant is, what can I know, not me as Immanuel Kant, but what I, as a transcendental ego, as he says, as a thinking subject, what can I know? And Kant's moment in a history of thought is a self-introspection of reason. So it's not a psychological introspection, it's a rational introspection, a rational inquiry. It is reason, which is the faculty of the mind, looking within itself, thinking about itself, questioning itself, studying itself, not psychologically, not empirically, but in a transcendental way, as Kant says. And for Kant, every thinking subject, human or non-human, had a transcendental ego, which was an immaterial self structured by what he calls the categories, which are the boxes or the classes that we use to classify being. I simplify. So the idea of Kant was that before trying to know the object, one should investigate about the subject, and the philosophy of Kant is the self-investigation of reason by itself. And the idea of Kant was that once the Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the critique of pure reason, which is self-criticism, an endeavor that reason takes to criticize itself, and to criticize is not necessarily negative. I don't know if the same word applies in English, but a movie critique is not someone who always criticizes in a negative way the movies that he watches, because a critique can be, and sometimes and most of the time, is a positive critique. To criticize means to go to the roots, to analyze, to investigate, to inspect, and to draw a conclusion. So if you criticize a movie, it can be a negative critique in the sense that this movie is not really good, or a positive critique by saying this is a masterpiece. But the difference between the guy who goes to the movie and says, whoa, this movie is a masterpiece, and the guy who criticizes the movie by analyzing, by considering, by inspecting, by weighing the movie, you can say this movie is a masterpiece, but I will show you why it is a masterpiece. And then the guy who enjoyed the movie and who then reads the criticism of the movie by the expert in cinema, he says, no, I understand why it's such a good movie, because you made me see why it is so good. And it's a double enjoyment. You can enjoy things like movies or art or books. That's the first thing, you enjoy the experience. But then if you understand why you enjoy the experience, it's a double enjoyment. That's a very Hegelian idea. And enjoying a movie we remain in the realm of movies here. Enjoying a movie is a movement of the soul. The soul is spontaneously attracted by good movies. But enjoying critically a movie is a movement of the mind, because it is the mind which has to explain to the soul why this movie or work of art or book or video game or whatever, why it is so good. And to develop taste in whatever aesthetic judgment. And aesthetic means the senses. It's not only beauty, because any sensation is an aesthetic perception, because it is perceived through the senses. So aesthetic has the double meaning, as implied by Kant, that it is what is perceived by the senses, and it is also the science or the theory of the beautiful, because the most pleasant sense experience that we can have is that of beauty, which can be perceived through the senses, but also maybe through the mind, because mathematicians often acknowledge that that a good mathematical theory is beautiful, and the physicists say that also. So beauty can be immaterial, and Plato already knew this. And the modern physicists who are atheists, the mathematicians who are atheists, they also acknowledge that immaterial beauty in the form of the conceptual understanding of a mathematical theory or theorem, or the understanding of a mathematical theory of physics is beautiful, and it's an aesthetic experience. But the problem is there are so few people who can understand theoretical physics that it kind of remains an esoteric possession by the very few who can have the knowledge and the skills and the IQ to grasp the theory of Einstein or of modern physics or whatever. So yeah. So Kant tried to save metaphysics, and his view is that after you've heard my criticism, so criticism is not necessarily negative. It implies a negative moment, but the result can be positive. And the idea of Kant was that I will criticize the faculty of knowledge. So it's an epistemological process. It's an inquiry about the capability, the possibility, and the limit of knowledge. And once my work is done, I will have set the foundation for the establishment of metaphysics, which in the mind of Kant would be a science which, like physics and mathematics, would be true for all time. Because in the view of Kant, mathematics was eternally true. And his will was to shake the foundations of knowledge in order to enable the possibility of building future knowledge. But he was kind of skeptical about this possibility, and one of the famous sentences by Kant is that I kind of destroyed knowledge in order to make room for faith, because he wanted to prove that one cannot know the soul or God, one can only believe in the existence of the soul and the immortality and immateriality of the soul and in God. So he was kind of conflicted, but yeah. So that's the story of the Enlightenment, made in 33 minutes. But now, there comes the Germans. And the Germans are... There's a lot to say about the Germans. They did not really... They were not really in tune with the Enlightenment. There were Enlightenment figures in Germany, but the German soul was kind of... I don't have the word to express this in English, kind of grumpy, maybe. The idea that they were not really satisfied with the French and the English criticizing God and metaphysics and thinking about business and how to make money. The Germans were more skeptical about skepticism itself. So they wanted to preserve a more esoteric, mystical, religious kind of knowledge. And they were nonetheless forced to acknowledge that something in the realm of spirit had happened in the 18th century, and thinkers like Fichte was partly influenced by Kant and by some French authors, but he remained eternally a German, I guess. So the Germans are a profoundly speculative people. Namely, they need to have an intimate conceptual experience of the divine, and deep down the Germans were not satisfied with the French attempt to eradicate God, so to speak. So we saw a kind of a revolt against the French, English, Enlightenment mind, which gave birth to the Sturm und Drang. I'm not very familiar with this movement, but yeah, and it was already the beginning of a romantic revolt against the Enlightenment, because Romanticism is the dialectical negation of the Age of Enlightenment, because the Romantic were opposed to the Enlightenment. They wanted to have a more passionate experience of reality, a more poetic experience, a more holistic experience, a religious experience, an aesthetic, an artistic experience. They were not satisfied with the dry and empty and abstract and kind of dead mechanism and abstraction of the Enlightenment. The clarity of the Age of Enlightenment was maybe too clear for the German. It kind of blinded their vision, and they wanted to darken the light in order to see more clearly, so to speak. It's not very clear what I'm saying, but there was a profound unsatisfactory state of mind with what was occurring in France. And the Romantic movement in Germany was being born in the later years of the 18th century, and there were men. I have the list. I have named the list in order. The most important. They are not all Romantics, but they are Germans or German citizens, because there are Jews in the list, who participated in the movement of spirit, as Hegel would try to conceptualize in his work. So in the period from the last 25 years of the 18th century to the first 15 years of the 19th century, broadly, people like Kant. I have explained what Kant tried to do. Then there was Fichte and Schelling. I will talk about them later. In the Romantic sphere, there was someone like Novalis. There were the classical German thinkers and writers like Goethe and Schiller, who were... it's difficult to classify them. They were so complex, but they are thought of as being thinkers of the Enlightenment, but they were not really thinkers of the Enlightenment. They were more complex. They are very hard to classify aesthetically and historically. And then there were people like Lessing and Reinhold and Jacobi, the Schlegel brothers, Schleiermacher, Hölderlin, Herder, Amann, and Moses Mendelssohn, who was a Jew. And all these Germans, they were kind of in a state of movement and bursting of ideas and conflictual state of mind and state of the soul, one might say. And this era, the turning moment of the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, is the most intense era in the entire history of mankind, probably, until now at least, in terms of flowering of spiritual, philosophical, and political viewpoints. And from a historical perspective, Hegel was born, from a historical perspective, in this era. And he was influenced both by the Enlightenment and by Romanticism. And the entire work of his life consisted in trying to conceptualize the unity of both. So he tried to make the synthesis out of a very conflicted, contradictory, moving world bursting forth with ideas and conflicting viewpoints. So the context of Hegel's appearance and the appearance of the science of logic, whose the purpose of this video was to comment the preface, and I have not even commented the first 4 lines, so yeah. The idea that I want to express, and it took me 40 minutes to express, just to comment the 4 first lines of the preface, is that Hegel understood. I am adopting a historical perspective here. Hegel understood that he was living an age of tremendous spiritual evolution and changes. And I will talk about Schelling and Fichte. From a historical perspective, which is not necessarily the most true, but I believe that it must be adopted nonetheless in order to the full evolution of human consciousness, in order for human consciousness to become conscious of itself. A thinker like Fichte and later Schelling, in the very late years of the 1790s and the very beginning of the 19th century, in the early years, they experienced a consciousness of the cosmos. In their writings, they became the mind of nature, becoming conscious of itself. They became the consciousness of the cosmos. It's very difficult to explain, but in his writings, Fichte speaks as the I, the self, but it is not the empirical self of the man named Fichte, the German philosopher. It's the self of the cosmos. I don't know how to explain this to people who have not experienced this cosmic consciousness, but the world spirit, so to speak, became conscious of himself from a historical perspective in this era through the minds of thinkers like Fichte and later Schelling. And in order to illustrate this, I could say that religious prophets like Moses or the prophets of the Ancient Testament or Muhammad, the religious people understand that they were the prophets of God. They were the voices of God on earth. So it was God, in the view of the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians, it was God who spoke through them. In the philosophical perspective, what happened historically at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in Germany is that the cosmos spoke through men like Fichte and Schelling, but it is not Fichte and Schelling who said, here's what the cosmos has to say. It is the cosmic consciousness, namely the mind of reality. And it can be defined as God, partly. The mind of reality spoke through these men. And Hegel understood what was happening. And now I will comment the first line. He says that the self-consciousness of spirit, the self-consciousness that spirit, which is cosmic spirit, world spirit, has acquired in this period of time from broadly 1787 to 1812, hasn't had any influence upon the structure of logic. So Hegel understood in a historical perspective, which I don't really believe is true, but I have to explain nonetheless, that there were massive political, aesthetic, metaphysical, religious, artistic and spiritual changes in the time that he was living in. It was a time, an era of massive changes. And he saw that there were changes in all spheres of life and intellectual life, but not yet upon logic. And if logic is the science of thought, if the thought that the world spirit or the cosmos or God in a way has upon himself, if he thinks differently about nature, about metaphysics, about religion, about politics, then he must think differently about thought itself. And this is what brings the need, in the view of Hegel, to reshape, restructure logic itself. And this is how the science of logic was born historically. And yeah, I have spent 46 minutes just to explain the first 4 lines of the book. And this book is so complicated that in order to understand 4 lines in the preface, which is not even the beginning of the book, it's just a preface. And Hegel says that a preface in a philosophical book is useless and should not even exist. So Hegel contradicts himself constantly. But the self-contradiction is precisely Hegel's thought. So Hegel contradicts himself to teach us that everything is contradictory, including thought, and especially Hegelian thought. So yeah. So I just spent a lot of time trying to explain from a historical perspective what happened in the mind of the historical Hegel, and the tremendously troubled world in which he lived. And his conclusion was that we need to think about logic. We need to think about thought itself, about thinking. And I will conclude by saying that I myself, as an individual, in the early decades of the 21st century, I have traveled a lot intellectually and spiritually over the past 6 years. And I have understood that we live in a time of change, intellectual changes, spiritual changes, conflicts, contradictions, movement, evolution, and change, and that in order to understand the modern world and to understand ourselves as thinking beings, we must think about thought itself, namely about logic, but the science of logic has already been written, so the question is not should we write a new logic. Maybe we should, but first we should examine whether the science of logic is true or not. And if it is true, how could Hegel know the truth of the 21st century in the early 19th century? That's a question to which I have no answer. And if it is false, it needs to be corrected. So, yeah. I will conclude by saying that the science of logic is a book full of mysteries. And if I wanted to make a joke, I would say that Hegel says that what is mysterious is mystical, what is mystical is speculative. So the science of logic is mysterious because it is speculative, because it is a book about speculative thinking. So it is logical that the science of logic should be mysterious. If I were to be honest, I would say that the speculative genius of whoever wrote the science of logic, whether it's Hegel or whether it's God, I don't know, but the speculative genius is the speculative genius is. We will begin with being, and we will not predicate any determination to being. It just is. Yeah.